They left her in the Nevada desert to die on a Tuesday morning. No horse, no water, no witnesses. By Friday, she was 30 feet above Silas Fitch on a canyon rimrock. His father's stolen gold stacked behind her, a dead outlaw's Winchester in her hands, and 5 armed men below her who had just watched her put 2 shots exactly where she intended them, and were no longer certain the third one would be a warning. Silas Fitch was the most dangerous man in the Nevada territory. He was currently begging. The Humboldt Desert did not care what happened to you. That was the first thing Nora Runningwater's grandmother had ever told her about the land, standing at the reservation's eastern boundary when Nora was 5 years old, pointing at the hard pan with a chin weathered by 60 Nevada winters. The desert does not care, so you must care enough for both of you. Nora was 31 years old on the Tuesday morning they dragged her off it. Gideon Pratt arrived at first light with 6 riders and a piece of federal paper he held out in front of him. The way men hold things they know will not survive scrutiny. Quickly, at a distance, with the expectation that the authority of the gesture would substitute for the legitimacy of the document. He was a Bureau of Indian Affairs agent with small eyes and the particular confidence of a man who has been permitted to do wrong things for long enough that he has stopped experiencing them as wrong. The charge was weapons possession, fabricated so carelessly it would have collapsed in front of any judge in the territory who had not already been spoken to. Nobody had been spoken to on Nora's behalf. That was not the kind of conversation that happened for women like her. She was given 60 seconds. She took her grandmother's skinning knife, a wool blanket, and the canteen hanging by the door. She did not take anything else because 60 seconds does not allow for sentiment, and because she understood, with the cold clarity of a woman who has survived hard things before, that what mattered now was not what she carried, but what she knew. They put her on a roan horse with a fever running behind its eyes and rode her 3 miles past the reservation boundary in silence. Pratt did not look at her once during the ride. Men like Pratt rarely looked at what they were doing. It made the doing easier. At the 3-mile mark, one of the riders cut her horse loose from the lead, and they turned back without a word. She watched them go. The desert opened up around her in every direction. White hardpan and black basalt, and the distant blue suggestion of the Humboldt Range sitting on the horizon like a promise nobody had made to her. Her horse walked another mile on fever and stubbornness before it stopped, and would not be persuaded otherwise. She left it in the shade of a basalt overhang with what water remained in the canteen's bottom, because the horse had not done anything to deserve what was happening to it, and because her grandmother had taught her that you do not punish creatures for the failures of men. Then she turned east and started walking. The sun was barely up. The hardpan stretched ahead of her without feature or mercy. Somewhere behind her, 30 miles west, the reservation boundary sat in the morning light, and beyond it, the land that her people had occupied since before Nevada territory had a name or a flag or a Bureau of Indian Affairs agent with flexible principles and a railroad baron's money in his coat pocket. Nora Runningwater did not look back. Looking back was not going to save her. Neither was anger, though she had enough of it to fuel a considerable fire. What was going to save her was the same thing that had always saved her: the specific accumulated knowledge of a woman who had grown up reading this desert the way other people read books, and who understood that the land which appeared to be trying to kill her was, if approached correctly, also the only thing capable of keeping her alive. She adjusted the blanket over her shoulders against the morning cold that would become afternoon heat before she was ready for it, checked the knife at her hip, and fixed her eyes on the eastern ridgeline. Her grandmother's voice came to her clearly, as it always did when things were at their worst. The desert does not care, so you must care enough for both of you. She cared. She walked. If Nora Runningwater already has your attention, good, because she is just getting started, and what she is about to find in that desert is going to change everything. Subscribe now and stay close. This story is only going to get bigger. The Nevada desert in autumn plays a particular trick on the unprepared. The mornings are cold enough to deceive you into moving too fast, burning energy you cannot replace. Then the sun climbs and the temperature doubles in the time it takes to cross a dry wash. And by midday, the hardpan is throwing heat upward from below as well as downward from above. And you are caught between two fires with nowhere to stand that isn't burning. Nora was not unprepared. She moved at the pace her grandmother had taught her. Not fast, not slow, but steady, the kind of pace that could be maintained for 8 hours without destroying the body that had to maintain it. She breathed through her nose. She kept the sun on her left shoulder in the morning and shifted it to her right after midday. She read the ground ahead of her for the specific texture that indicated subsurface moisture and found it twice before noon, digging with the skinning knife at the base of a dried creek bed until the clay turned dark and she could press her fingers into something that was not quite water but was enough. The desert was not empty. That was what people who feared it never understood. It was full of information, of direction, of resource, of the kind of knowledge that only revealed itself to those who had stopped demanding that the land speak their language and had learned instead to speak its. She found water on the first afternoon at a basalt formation she had not visited since she was 19 years old, following a trail of Mormon tea plants growing in a line too deliberate to be accidental. Their roots tracking a subsurface seep that the hardpan above it gave no indication of. She drank slowly, refilled the canteen, sat in the basalt shadow for 20 minutes no more and moved on. She ate what the desert offered. Pinyon nuts from a stand of trees tucked into a north-facing slope where the frost had not yet stripped them. The roots of a sand lily she dug from the creekbed margin at dusk. A jackrabbit that made the mistake of holding still long enough in the late afternoon light. Taken cleanly with a thrown stone because she was not going to waste the noise of steel on a rabbit when she did not know who else was in this desert with her. At night she slept in shallow caves and rock overhangs, building her fire small and shielded, never more than she needed and never visible from the ridgeline. She was being hunted. She assumed this with the practical certainty of a woman who understood that men who go to the trouble of fabricating a federal weapons charge do not then forget about the person they filed it against. Whether Pratt had sent riders after her or simply expected the desert to finish what he had started, she could not know. She behaved as though riders were coming regardless. It was the safer assumption. On the second night, she allowed herself to think about what had happened. Not to grieve it. Grief was a luxury with a time and a place, and neither was here. But to understand it with the analytical precision that would determine what she did next. Pratt had not acted alone. The fabricated charge, the speed of the removal, the federal paper already prepared and waiting, that was not one corrupt agent's improvisation. That was an operation. Someone with reach and money had decided the reservation land needed to be empty. And Nora had been the obstacle most conveniently removed first. She already knew about the silver. Had known for 6 weeks, since a Paiute elder named Gus Manyhorses had shown her the outcropping on the reservation's eastern slope, the blue-gray vein running through the quartz at an angle that any mining man in the territory would have recognized immediately. She had told no one outside the reservation. She had not needed to. Someone else had already found it. On the third morning, she woke before dawn and lay still in the rock shelter listening to the desert's honest hour. That particular silence just before the light comes, when the night creatures have gone quiet and the day creatures have not yet begun and the land itself seems to be taking stock of what it is. Her grandmother had taught her to listen during this hour, that the desert told its truest things in those few minutes before the sun made everything complicated again. What she heard was wind moving through a slot canyon a quarter-mile to the northeast. She had sheltered in that canyon once at age 9 during a 3-day dust storm that had reduced the desert to a howling brown nothing. She had not been back since. It was narrow and concealed, and the entry was so unobvious from the hardpan approach that you could walk past it 10 times without finding it if you did not already know where to look. She found the creek bed that fed into it. Dry now but marked by the specific vegetation that followed underground water through the desert, the way rumors follow trouble. Persistently, reliably, in the direction of the source. She followed it northeast. The slot canyon swallowed her like a secret. One moment she was on the open hardpan, the Humboldt sky enormous and indifferent above her, the wind cutting across the basin floor with the particular meanness of a Nevada autumn afternoon. Then the basalt walls rose on either side, narrowing to 10 feet, then 8, then 6, and the wind dropped to nothing and the sound of her own breathing became the loudest thing in the world. She remembered it immediately, the way the walls curved left after 30 yards, the way the floor leveled out into a broader chamber, maybe 40 feet across, where the creek bed widened, and the walls pulled back, and the afternoon light came down from a narrow strip of sky above in a single clean column that moved across the chamber floor as the sun tracked west. She had spent 3 days in this chamber at age 9, listening to the dust storm howl harmlessly overhead, eating the provisions her father had packed her, and sleeping more than she had ever slept before or since. She was not expecting what the chamber contained now. She stopped. The column of afternoon light fell across saddlebags, dozens of them, stacked against the eastern wall with a systematic care that spoke of a man who intended to return for them. They were covered in 3 years of desert dust but intact. The leather dried and cracked, but the buckle still holding. The contents. She crossed to the nearest one and opened it with hands that had gone very still, dense and cold and yellow in the afternoon light. Gold bullion. Stamped bars, each one marked with the assay office seal of the Nevada Territory Mint. She stood over them for a long moment. The chamber was very quiet. The light moved slowly across the floor. Against the western wall, beside the collapsed ruins of a supply crate, a bedroll lay in the dust. There were bones in it, a man's bones, undisturbed, the skeleton still wearing the remnants of a canvas duster and a pair of leather boots that had outlasted everything else about him. A tin star had fallen from the duster's breast and lay in the dust beside the bedroll, which told her nothing since half the outlaws in the territory had stolen tin stars at one point or another. The leather satchel was tucked behind the saddlebags, wrapped in a length of oilskin tied with a cord that had gone stiff with age. She cut it with her grandmother's knife and opened it carefully. Journals. 3 of them, bound in dark leather, filled from cover to cover in a small, precise hand. Territorial survey maps, annotated in the same hand, with notations so detailed and organized, they read less like an outlaw's records and more like a legal brief. Wanted posters, including one for a Dex Caldwell, Nevada Territory, $2,000 reward, armed and extremely dangerous, with corrections written in the margins in the same precise hand, correcting the poster's inaccuracies with the particular irritation of a man who objected to being misrepresented even on his own wanted notice. She understood then. The bones in the bedroll were Dex Caldwell's. The most wanted man in the Nevada Territory had died alone in this canyon 3 years ago, 30 feet from enough gold to buy half of Carson City, with nobody to tell and nowhere left to go. She built a fire, small, shielded, just enough light to read by. She opened the first journal at the beginning and did not look up for 4 hours. By the time the canyon walls had gone from amber to purple to black above her, and the strip of sky had filled with Nevada stars so dense they looked structural, she had read enough to understand that the story the territory had been telling itself about the Caldwell heist for 3 years was wrong in almost every particular that mattered. Dex Caldwell had not stolen the gold for himself. He had stolen it from Harlow Fitch. And Harlow Fitch, whose name appeared on railroad depots and territorial land offices from Winnemucca to Carson City, was the man who had stolen it first. From settlers, from miners, from tribal communities, from every person who had ever signed a land agreement with his syndicate, and discovered too late that the agreement meant whatever Harlow Fitch needed it to mean on a given day. The reservation land, the silver vein, Gideon Pratt and his federal paper and his 6 riders at first light. It was all the same operation. It had always been the same operation. Nora sat in the firelight with the journal open in her lap and the Nevada desert silent and enormous around her, and felt the specific quality of fury that comes not from surprise but from confirmation, the fury of a woman who suspected the shape of a thing and has just been shown its full dimensions. She was not going to die in this desert. She was going to burn Harlow Fitch to the ground. She just needed to figure out how. She heard the horse before she saw the rider. It was the 4th morning, just past dawn, and she had been reorganizing Caldwell's journals into chronological order with the focused attention of a woman building a case, which was precisely what she was doing. The horse's hooves on the canyon floor had the particular careful placement of an animal being ridden by someone who did not want to be heard, which told her immediately that whoever was coming already knew the canyon was occupied. She set the journals down, picked up Caldwell's rifle, a Winchester 1866, that she had spent 2 days acquainting herself with, running through the loading and firing mechanism with methodical repetition until her hands knew it without her eyes, and positioned herself behind the saddlebag stack with the chamber's entry point in her sight line. The rider came around the left-hand curve and stopped. He was lean and weathered, somewhere north of 40, wearing a deputy marshal's badge on a canvas duster that had seen considerable use. He had a rifle across his saddle and the particular stillness of a man who is very good at his profession and is currently calculating how many ways the present situation could go wrong for him. He looked at Nora behind the saddlebags, looked at the Winchester, looked at the gold, looked back at Nora. "Deputy Marshal Clem Boward," he said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man who has learned that tone is tactical. "Nevada Territory." "I can read the badge," Nora said. "I expect you can." He did not reach for his rifle. That was a point in his favor. "I've been tracking a lead on the Caldwell Gold for 3 years. Came within 2 miles of this canyon 4 times and missed it 4 times. A pause. "You found it in 3 days." "I grew up here," Nora said. "You didn't." He absorbed this without visible offense, which was another point in his favor. "Those his journals?" "Yes." "Have you read them?" "Most of them." He was quiet for a moment, his horse shifting under him with the patient restlessness of an animal that has been ridden a long way recently. "I'm going to get down," he said. "My rifle stays on the saddle. I'd appreciate the same courtesy from you, but I understand if that's not where you are yet." Nora kept the Winchester where it was. "Get down," she said slowly. He got down slowly. He tied the horse to a basalt outcropping and came to the fire and crouched across from her with his hands visible and his eyes on the journals. She watched him the way she watched everything in this desert, without the performance of watchfulness. Just a steady, comprehensive attention that missed nothing. "You're Nora Runningwater," he said. It was not a question. "You know who I am. I know Gideon Pratt filed a removal order on you 4 days ago. I know the charge doesn't hold water. I know Pratt has been on Harlow Fitch's payroll for 2 years. He looked up from the journals. I've been building a case against Fitch for 8 months. I'm missing the financial documentation that ties the land fraud to specific transactions." He nodded at the journals. "Is it in there?" Nora looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the canyon walls were warming in the early light, the strip of sky above them going from gray to pale blue. "Every transaction," she said, "documented in Caldwell's hand, cross-referenced with Territorial Land Office records he copied before he left Fitch's employ. Dates, amounts, parcel numbers, names." She paused. "Including the Paiute reservation land that Fitch has been trying to clear since he found the silver vein on its eastern slope." Something moved through Boward's expression that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction, but carried elements of both. He looked at the journals, then at the gold, then at Nora. "If I told you I wanted to get this to a federal judge in Carson City," he said carefully, "what would you tell me?" "I would tell you," Nora said, "that you are going to need someone who knows this desert to get you there alive, and that I am going to need someone with a badge to make sure the evidence isn't dismissed before it reaches the courtroom." She held his gaze. "And I would tell you that my people's land is in those journals, and if you think you're walking out of this canyon without me, you have significantly misjudged the situation." Boward looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down fully, crossed his legs, and reached for the nearest journal. "Start from the beginning," he said. "Tell me what you know." It was the beginning of the most consequential and uncomfortable partnership the Nevada Territory had ever produced. Forging a dead outlaw's hidden canyon over a fire built from desert scrub, between a half-Paiute woman with a stolen rifle and a deputy marshal with 8 months of incomplete casework, and the slowly dawning recognition that the woman across the fire from him was considerably more dangerous and considerably more necessary than anyone had apparently thought to warn him about. Boward read for the better part of a day. Nora let him. She used the time productively, taking inventory of the saddlebags with the systematic thoroughness of a woman who understood that knowing exactly what you have is the first requirement of knowing what you can do with it. 43 bars of gold bullion, each one stamped and traceable. 3 territorial survey maps annotated in Caldwell's hand. 14 separate land transaction records copied in full from the Territorial Land Office, each one bearing Fitch's syndicate seal. And the journals themselves, 3 volumes covering 2 years of Caldwell's time inside Fitch's operation, written with the precise fury of a man who had decided that if he was going to burn his life down, he was at least going to document exactly why. Dex Caldwell, she had come to understand, was not the man his wanted poster described. He had been a territorial surveyor of some skill, educated in the East, recruited by Fitch's syndicate in 1869 to survey land parcels for acquisition. He had done his job efficiently and without moral complication for the better part of a year, until the day he surveyed a parcel of Paiute reservation land on the Humboldt's eastern basin, and was told by Fitch's land manager to record it as unoccupied federal territory. It was occupied. He knew it. He had spoken to the people living on it. He had drunk water from their well and eaten food from their fire, and listened to an elder explain the boundaries of the land in terms of creeks and ridge lines and seasonal grazing routes that had nothing to do with territorial survey markers and everything to do with 3 generations of living on a specific piece of earth. He had falsified the record. He had known it was wrong. And for 6 months, he had done nothing, because doing nothing is the easiest thing in the world when the alternative is expensive. Then Fitch's operation expanded, more parcels, more falsified surveys, more families displaced by paperwork they could not read, backed by law enforcement that Fitch had purchased the same way he purchased survey equipment and timber rights, as a business expense, carefully recorded and efficiently deployed. Caldwell had started keeping his own records at that point, quietly in parallel, noting every transaction that his official surveys supported and every family that those transactions erased. He had not known what he was going to do with the records. He had simply known that someone needed to be keeping them, and that he was, through his own prior failure, the only person positioned to do it. The heist had been the culmination of 2 years of that parallel record-keeping. He had taken the gold not from a mint or a bank or a stage line, but from Fitch's private assay operation. Gold extracted from mines on land that Fitch had fraudulently acquired, processed through an assay operation that existed outside the territorial record entirely. Stolen gold melted and restamped. Caldwell had taken it and hidden it and died with it. And the territory had spent 3 years looking for a simple outlaw when what it had actually lost was a witness. Boward finished the 3rd journal as the afternoon light was beginning its descent down the canyon walls. He sat with it closed in his hands for a considerable time, saying nothing. Nora watched him. "Fitch has a territorial judge in his pocket in Winnemucca," Boward said finally. "Circuit judge in Elko too, probably. Carson City is the only court with federal jurisdiction that he hasn't reached." He set the journal down with the careful deliberateness of a man placing something he understands to be significant. "This is enough. If we can get this to Judge Arlo Denham in Carson City, this is enough to bring the entire syndicate down. How long to Carson City from here? 4 days. Maybe 5, the way we'll need to travel." "We won't travel straight," Nora said. "Fitch will have people watching the main routes. I know a way through the Black Rock that adds half a day and eliminates 3 of the 4 obvious intercept points." Boward looked at her with the expression of a man who is recalibrating something. "You've thought about this already." "I've thought about nothing else since the 1st journal," Nora said. "We leave tomorrow before dawn. We travel light. The gold stays here. We don't need it yet, and it will slow us. The journals go inside oilskin, distributed between us so that losing one doesn't mean losing everything." She paused. "And we need to talk about Silas Fitch." Boward's expression shifted. "What do you know about Silas?" "I know he's been in the Humboldt Basin for 3 weeks with a tracker and 4 hired men," Nora said. "I've seen their fire twice from the rim rock southeast moving this direction. Harlow sent him to find the gold. He's going to find this canyon. When?" Nora looked at the canyon entry point, at the walls, at the single narrow approach. "Day after tomorrow," she said. "Maybe sooner." She picked up the Winchester and began checking the mechanism with the focused calm of a woman who has already decided how this particular problem is going to be resolved, and is simply making sure her equipment is equal to her intention. Boward watched her. He had been a deputy marshal for 11 years, and he had worked alongside some capable people in that time. He was fairly certain he had never worked alongside anyone quite like this. Silas Fitch arrived the next morning, which was sooner than Nora had calculated, and exactly when she had prepared for anyway, because in her experience, the only reliable thing about dangerous men arriving was that they arrived before you were ready, and you had better be ready regardless. She heard the tracker first, a Boyd Casker, lean and quiet, reading the canyon entry the way a man reads a thing he has been paid to find. Then Silas himself, on a black horse that cost more than most Nevada Territory men earned in 2 years, followed by 4 hired guns who had the specific look of men who had been doing this kind of work long enough to have stopped thinking about what it was. 6 men total, 1 narrow canyon entry, walls 40 feet high on both sides. She was already on the rim rock. She had climbed it before dawn, in the dark, pulling herself up the basalt face by handholds she had memorized the previous afternoon in the light. The Winchester was across her back. Her grandmother's knife was at her hip. The cold of the pre-dawn rock had worked its way through her blanket and into her hands, and she had breathed through it steadily and kept climbing. Boward was positioned on the opposite rim rock, 20 yards back, his rifle resting across a flat basalt ledge with the patient stillness of a man who trusts the plan and the planner. Below, Silas rode into the canyon entry and stopped. The chamber was visible from where he sat. The saddlebags against the eastern wall, the fire pit, the carefully arranged evidence of occupation. What was not visible were the two people 30 feet above him on opposite sides of the canyon rim. "Hello, the camp," Silas called. His voice was his father's voice, smooth, carrying the practiced warmth of a man who has spent his life using pleasantness as a preliminary to something less pleasant. Silence. He rode forward. His men followed. Casker the tracker came last, and it was Casker who stopped first, looking up at the rimrock with the instinct of a man whose profession has trained him to look at exactly the places other men don't think to look. He was looking at the right place. He was a half-second too late. "Marshal's office," Boward called from the eastern rim, his voice carrying down the canyon walls with the particular authority of a man who has been doing this for 11 years. "You are in the presence of a federal investigation, and I am ordering you to drop your weapons and dismount." What happened next happened fast. Two of the hired guns went for their rifles and found themselves looking at a Winchester from above on one side and Boward's rifle from above on the other, which is the specific geometry that tends to produce rapid reconsideration. One man dropped his weapon. The other held his for 3 seconds longer than was wise before the rock chip that Nora's shot kicked off the canyon wall 6 inches from his horse's ear convinced him otherwise. The third hired gun ran, simply turned his horse and rode back up the canyon entry the way they had come. And nobody stopped him, because 4 was already manageable and 5 would have been complicated. Casker raised his hand slowly with the expression of a professional who recognizes a superior position and sees no financial incentive in dying for it. That left Silas. He sat on his black horse in the middle of the canyon chamber and looked up at Nora on the rimrock above him, and his face went through several things in quick succession before settling on the cold fury of a man who has never in his life been outmaneuvered by anyone he considered worth outmaneuvering, and is finding the experience both novel and unbearable. "You are a reservation Indian with a stolen rifle," he said, his voice stripped now of all the practiced warmth. "You have no legal standing. Whatever you think you found in here, it belongs to my father's syndicate, and I will have a territorial judge confirm that within a week of returning to Carson City." Nora looked down at him from the rimrock for a long moment. "Your father's syndicate," she said, "is documented in 3 journals in that satchel by the fire. Every fraudulent survey, every falsified land transaction, every payment to every judge and every bureau agent including Gideon Pratt." She paused. "Including the payment to the Winnemucca Circuit Judge that you are planning to use to validate a claim on stolen land." Another pause, shorter. "We have already read all of it, Mr. Fitch. So has Marshal Boward. So the question of what belongs to your father's syndicate is going to be settled in Carson City by Judge Arlo Denham, who, as far as either of us has been able to determine, has not yet been purchased by anyone." Silas Fitch's jaw tightened. "Get down off the horse," Boward said from the eastern rim. "Slowly, hands where I can see them." He got down. They bound him to a juniper trunk at the canyon's inner wall, securely and without ceremony, while his remaining men sat disarmed in the dust of the chamber floor, and Casker the tracker studied the middle distance with the philosophical detachment of a man reviewing his career choices. Nora climbed down from the rimrock and stood in front of Silas Fitch and looked at him. This man who had ridden into this desert on his father's money to bury what was in those journals the same way his father had buried everything else inconvenient. And she felt the full weight of what she was carrying settle and clarify into something clean and purposeful. "My people have been on that land for 3 generations, she said quietly. "Your father decided a silver vein was worth more than that. You rode out here to make sure he got away with it." She turned away from him and picked up the satchel of journals. "He's not going to get away with it," she said. She smelled the campfire before she saw the light. They had been moving through the black rock for 2 hours after leaving the canyon. Silas Fitch bound across his own horse and his 2 remaining men walking ahead at gunpoint, Casker scouting the path with the cooperative energy of a man who has identified where his interests now reside. The fire was small and well-positioned, tucked into a basalt hollow that shielded its light from 3 directions. Someone who knew the desert had built that fire. Nora knew only one other person who knew this particular stretch of the Black Rock well enough to camp in it without being seen. She handed the Winchester to Boward without explanation and walked toward the hollow alone. Her brother was sitting with his back against the basalt, a tin cup in his hands, looking at her with the expression of a man who has been expecting this and has had no idea what to do with the expectation. Trace Runningwater was 27 years old and had their father's jaw and their mother's eyes and a railroad scout's canvas jacket that he wore with the careful neatness of a man who understands that appearances are a kind of argument. He had always been the careful one, the one who watched how things worked and then worked within them, who believed that the way to survive in the Nevada territory of 1874 was to make yourself useful to the people who had the power to decide whether you survived. It was not a cowardly position. Nora had never thought it was cowardly. It was a position born from the same conditions that had produced her own choices, the same impossible ground, the same brutal arithmetic of survival, and it had simply arrived at a different answer. She sat down across the fire from him. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. "You're working for Fitch," she said. "I'm working for the railroad," Trace said, "as a scout. It's legitimate work and it pays." "The railroad is Fitch," Nora said. "The railroad has always been Fitch. The survey contracts, the land acquisition, the bureau appointments, it's all the same operation, and it has always been the same operation." She reached into the satchel and took out the second journal, opened it to a page she had marked, and set it on the ground between them. "That is a record of the payment made to Gideon Pratt for executing my removal. It is dated 6 weeks ago. The authorization signature belongs to Harlow Fitch." She paused. "Countersigned by the railroad's territorial operations manager." Trace looked at the journal. His cup had gone very still in his hands. "The man whose name is on that counter-signature," Nora said, "is the man who hired you." The fire popped between them. Somewhere out in the Black Rock, a coyote called once and went quiet. Boward was 30 yards back in the dark, keeping his distance with the professional tact of a man who understood that some conversations require privacy to be honest. Trace looked at the journal for a long time. Then he set his cup down and picked it up and read the page she had marked. Then he turned back 6 pages and read those too, his face going through a series of expressions that Nora watched without comment. The careful, incremental dismantling of a position that a man has held for 3 years and built his survival on, happening in real time over a campfire in the Nevada desert. "I didn't know," he said finally. His voice was very quiet. "I know you didn't," Nora said. "I'm not here to accuse you of knowing. I'm here because you're my brother and because what I'm carrying in this satchel is going to Carson City, and it has the power to restore the reservation land and end Fitch's syndicate entirely. And I need to know whether you're going to help me get it there or whether I need to think of you as an obstacle." The word hit him. She had meant it to. Not cruelly, she had no cruelty left for Trace, only the specific, painful honesty that you can only afford with someone you love enough to tell the truth to. He looked at her across the fire, at the journals, at the skinning knife at her hip, and the way she sat, straight-backed, entirely certain, a woman who had walked 3 days across the Humboldt Desert and found Dex Caldwell's hidden canyon and outmaneuvered Silas Fitch on a canyon rim and was now sitting across a campfire in the Black Rock in the middle of the night with the documented destruction of Harlow Fitch's empire in a leather satchel across her knees, asking her brother which side of history he intended to be found on. He looked at her for a long time. Then he reached into his jacket and took out the railroad scout's identification papers, his wages, his standing, his 3 years of careful accommodation, and dropped them into the fire. They curled and caught and burned with a brief, bright light. "Tell me what you need," he said. Nora looked at her brother across the flames. "I need a scout who knows the Black Rock route to Carson City," she said, "and I need him to leave now." Trace stood, kicked dirt over his fire, and picked up his gear. They left within the hour, moving through the Nevada dark in the particular formation of people who have decided, without ceremony or hesitation, that they are going somewhere together and intend to arrive. The journey to Carson City took 5 days. They moved through the Black Rock on Trace's route, cutting south through the Quinn River Valley and picking up the Truckee Meadows Road 2 days east of the city. Silas Fitch rode bound and silent on his black horse for the first 3 days and spent the 4th and 5th attempting various forms of negotiation that Boward declined with the consistent brevity of a man who has heard most of what money can say and has already decided it isn't speaking his language today. The 5th hired gun found them on the 3rd day, which Nora had anticipated. He came up the Quinn River Valley with 2 additional riders, reinforcements Silas had apparently arranged before entering the canyon, a contingency plan that spoke to either caution or experience or both. The confrontation lasted less than a minute. Trace had positioned himself on the valley's western ridge before dawn, reading the approach with the instinct of a man who has spent 3 years learning how people move through Nevada Territory terrain. 3 shots from the ridge, none of them hitting anything except the ground and the confidence of the men standing on it, and the riders turned back. Trace climbed down from the ridge without commentary and fell back into position beside Nora without breaking stride. She said nothing, neither did he. The language between them had always been more action than word, and 3 years of distance had not changed that fundamental grammar. Carson City arrived on the morning of the 5th day, its buildings rising from the valley floor against the backdrop of the Sierra Nevada in the particular way of Western territorial capitals. Aspirational, slightly raw, wearing its ambitions on its exterior like a man in a good suit, who is still learning how to sit in it. The federal courthouse sat on the main street, 2 stories of imported brick that Nora had never entered in her life, for reasons that were both legal and practical, and that she was about to set aside permanently. Judge Arlo Denham was a compact, meticulous man of 60 who had the reputation of being the most procedurally rigorous jurist in the Nevada Territory, which meant that he was also the least susceptible to the kind of informal arrangements that Harlow Fitch preferred. He received Boward in his chambers within the hour and took the satchel of journals with the careful hands of a man who understands when something significant has been placed in front of him. He read for 2 hours without interruption. Nora waited in the courthouse hallway with Trace beside her, and Silas Fitch secured in the marshal's office downstairs, and she watched the people of Carson City move past the courthouse windows and thought about Gus Many Horses, showing her the silver vein in the reservation's eastern slope. His voice careful and low, trusting her with something he understood was dangerous. She thought about her grandmother's voice in the honest hour before dawn. She thought about the bones in the bedroll in the canyon chamber, and the 3 journals written by a man who had known too much and done the wrong thing for too long, and had finally, at enormous personal cost, chosen to do the right one. Denham called them in after 2 hours. He was a precise man, and he was precise now, laying out what the journals established and what they did not establish, and what additional documentation would be required to complete the federal case. It was not a Hollywood moment. It was a procedural conversation in conducting careful legal language by a careful legal man, and it confirmed that the case was real and sufficient, and that Harlow Fitch's syndicate had, through the survival of Dex Caldwell's documentation, finally encountered a problem it could not purchase its way around. Harlow Fitch was summoned to Carson City by federal order 3 days later. He arrived with 2 lawyers and the specific confidence of a man who has sent for lawyers in difficult situations before and found them adequate. The federal proceeding that followed was not brief, and it was not simple, and it was conducted entirely without drama, which is how actual justice tends to work when it works at all. Quietly, procedurally, without the satisfaction of a clean moment, but with the slow accumulation of documented fact that eventually becomes impossible to argue with. Nora sat in that courtroom every day of the proceeding. She had no legal standing to be there in any formal sense, which was its own commentary on the territory's limitations, and she sat there anyway, in the 3rd row, beside Trace, and watched Caldwell's journals entered into evidence 1 transaction at a time. Gideon Pratt's name came up on the 2nd day. His authorization payments on the 4th, the reservation land survey falsification on the 6th. On the 8th day, Harlow Fitch's lawyer requested a recess and did not return from it. His client was found that evening in his Carson City hotel room, having made the specific kind of exit that men of his type sometimes make when the distance between where they are and where they are going becomes too short to bear. Silas Fitch went to federal prison. The syndicate's assets were frozen pending full audit. The Territorial Land Office began the process of reviewing every parcel that Fitch's surveys had touched, a process that Judge Denham indicated would take the better part of a year and would result in significant reversals. The reservation land restoration order was signed on a Thursday morning in early November. Boward brought Nora the copy in the courthouse hallway. He handed it to her without ceremony, the way he did most things, and she took it and read it once, carefully, and folded it, and put it inside her coat against her chest, where she had carried the original deed on the ride from the canyon. Caldwell would have wanted this, Boward said. Caldwell wanted it badly enough to steal 43 bars of gold bullion and die alone in a desert canyon for it, Nora said. I think he'd consider this adequate. Something that might have been a smile moved briefly across Boward's face. What will you do now? He asked. Nora looked out the courthouse window at the Sierra Nevada, white-capped and enormous against the November sky. Go home, she said. The reservation in winter was a different country from the reservation in autumn, and Nora had been gone long enough that returning to it felt, for a brief and disorienting moment, like arriving somewhere new. Then Gus Many Horses came out of his dwelling and looked at her with eyes that had been doing the particular work of waiting, the kind of waiting that does not pace or fret, but simply holds its position with the patience of something that knows the land better than it knows urgency. And the disorientation passed, and she was simply home. The restoration order took 3 months to translate into physical reality. Federal processes move at federal pace, which is to say they move the way the Black Rock Desert moves in summer imperceptibly, until one day you look up and something has shifted and you cannot say exactly when it happened. There were surveyors, and there were hearings, and there were documents requiring signatures and countersignatures, and there were men from the Territorial Land Office who came out to the reservation boundary with their equipment and their careful faces, and conducted themselves with the particular efficiency of people who understand that a federal judge is watching. The silver vein on the eastern slope was the subject of a separate proceeding that Boward handled from his end of the territory. The outcome was not everything Nora had wanted, it rarely was, but the mining rights remained with the tribal community rather than passing to the syndicate's receivership, which was the specific outcome that mattered most and which Caldwell had documented the theft of most precisely. Gideon Pratt was removed from his position and indicted on federal fraud charges. He fled the territory before his hearing date and was not found, which was the kind of imperfect ending that actual history produces, and that Nora accepted with the equanimity of a woman who has learned to distinguish between the justice she can achieve and the justice she wanted. Trace stayed. This was not a foregone conclusion, and she had not assumed it would be. He had burned his railroad papers in the Black Rock, and that was a gesture, and gestures require the work of daily choices to become facts. He made those choices, quietly and consistently, the way he did everything. Finding his place on the reservation not in the dramatic terms of a man who has publicly renounced something, but in the plain terms of someone who has simply come back and intends to be useful. He helped rebuild the eastern boundary fencing that Fitch's men had pulled down during the survey operation. He taught the younger men the desert tracking skills he had spent 3 years developing in the railroad's employ, repurposing what he had learned in Fitch's service into something that served his own people instead. It was not a redemption narrative. It was just a man doing the necessary work of being where he was supposed to be. Boward came back to the reservation once, in the spring, with papers confirming the final disposition of the Fitch Syndicate assets and a formal federal acknowledgement of Nora's role in the case that was worded so carefully and gave her so little actual credit that she read it twice to make sure she was understanding it correctly. She was understanding it correctly. It was the most the territorial legal system of 1875 was capable of producing for a half Paiute woman who had done the decisive work of a federal investigation. And it was simultaneously grossly insufficient and more than anyone had expected, which was exactly the tension she had been living inside her entire life. She thanked Boward for bringing it personally. He said it was on his way, which was not true, and they both knew it was not true, and neither of them said so. Dex Caldwell's bones were recovered from the canyon and given a proper burial in Carson City, arranged quietly by Boward through a contact at the territorial church. The grave marker listed his name and his dates and nothing else, which was both insufficient and probably what he would have wanted. A man who had spent 2 years keeping meticulous secret records was unlikely to have been comfortable with public narration of his own story. The gold was entered into the federal asset pool and applied toward the restitution claims filed by the families Fitch's syndicate had displaced. 43 bars of bullion did not cover the full sum of what had been taken from those families. It covered more than anyone had previously thought possible. Nora built a small adobe structure at the eastern edge of the restored reservation land, 20 yards from the boundary marker, looking out toward the Black Rock. She built it herself over the course of 2 months, with assistance from Gus Many Horses and 2 younger men who came to help without being asked and stayed without being invited to leave, which she understood as a form of welcome she had not expected, and did not know how to refuse and eventually stopped trying to. The structure was not large. One room, a sleeping alcove, a fireplace she engineered herself from the basalt that the boundary area offered in abundance. A window facing east, because she had spent enough of her life watching things end and preferred now to position herself toward beginnings. She kept Caldwell's journals. Boward had offered to take them into federal custody as part of the case record, and she had declined with a politeness that left no room for negotiation. And he had not pushed the point because he was a man who understood when a thing belonged to someone. She kept them in a cedar box she made from timber off the reservation's northern slope. And she took them out sometimes in the evenings and read a few pages, not the legal documentation, which she knew nearly by memory at this point, but the earlier entries, the ones from Caldwell's first year with the syndicate, before he understood what he was part of, the ones where you could watch a man beginning to know something he did not want to know and choosing for too long not to act on it. She understood that progression. She had her own version of it, the 6 weeks between finding the silver vein and being dragged off the reservation, during which she had known that something was coming and had told herself that knowing was not the same as being able to stop it. There was a version of Nora Runningwater who had sat with that knowledge for 6 weeks and done nothing, and that woman had been expelled into the desert on a Tuesday morning with a dying horse and a half-empty canteen. The desert had given her back something better than what she had before. Not safety. The Nevada Territory of 1875 was not a place that offered safety to women who looked like her and knew what she knew and were willing to say so. But something more durable than safety. The specific knowledge, tested and confirmed under conditions that did not allow for self-deception, of exactly what she was capable of. On winter evenings, when the black rock went from gold to purple to the deep blue-black of a Nevada night and the stars came out in their dense structural abundance, and the desert settled into its honest silence, Nora sat in the doorway of her adobe house and listened to the land the way her grandmother had taught her. The desert did not care. It never had. She cared enough for both of them. That had always been enough. She understood now that it always would be.